On November 9, 1918, the troop transport USS Henderson entered the harbor at Brest, carrying American Marines who had crossed the Atlantic to fight Germany. Among them was a young railroad man from Michigan named Leo Thompson. He had endured months of exhausting training, a deadly influenza pandemic, crowded troop trains, quarantine, seasickness, and a voyage through waters where German submarines still posed a threat. At last, France stood before him. But Leo had arrived at the most unexpected moment possible. In less than 48 hours, the guns of the First World War would fall silent. A little more than 3 months earlier, Leo had been a recent high school graduate in Schoolcraft, Michigan, a small community along the railroad between Detroit and Chicago. Railroads were part of his family's life, and trains connected nearly every part of the world he knew. But on August 1, 1918, a train carried him away from that familiar world. He traveled first to Grand Rapids and then continued through Detroit, Toledo, Cincinnati, Louisville, and Atlanta. His destination was Parris Island, South Carolina, where the Marine Corps would attempt to transform a railroad worker into a fighting man. The journey introduced Leo to Americans he might never otherwise have met. Some came from farms, others from mines, factories, telephone companies, and large cities. A few were younger than 18 and had enlisted with permission from their families. They spoke with different accents, had different levels of education, and carried different reasons for joining the service. Inside the barracks, however, those differences became secondary. They were all recruits, and the Marine Corps expected the same discipline from each of them. The United States had entered the war in April 1917, but by the summer of 1918, the struggle in Europe had reached a decisive phase. Marines of the 4th Brigade had already fought at Belleau-Wood, Soissons, Saint-Mihiel, Blancmont, and in the Meuse-Argonne. Their reputation was being written in casualties as well as victories. Leo knew that he might soon join them. Before that could happen, he had to survive Parris Island. His first weeks were dominated by drilling that began early in the morning and continued until late in the evening. The recruits marched, exercised, studied military procedures, maintained their equipment, and learned to respond immediately to commands. Leo paid close attention to the details of his new life, even the boots and uniforms. As the grandson of a shoemaker, he noticed the construction of the footwear issued to the recruits and carefully compared plain soles with the hobnailed boots received by other men. The rifle range became one of his greatest challenges. Leo had grown up around railroads, not hunting fields, and had little experience with firearms before entering the Marine Corps. He trained with the Springfield rifle at a series of distances, eventually firing at targets 500 yards away. His vision troubled him on the longer ranges and his scores began to suffer. On the final rapid-fire exercise, he needed a minimum result to qualify. He managed to exceed it. That success mattered. Marksmanship stood at the center of Marine training and identity. Leo earned his qualification, a small medal, and additional monthly pay. During pistol practice, an instructor was surprised by his accuracy and assumed he had fired before. Physical competition offered another source of confidence. Wearing boots and a complete uniform, Leo outjumped other men in his battalion during high jump practice. The transformation appeared to be working. The high school graduate from Michigan was becoming a Marine, and France seemed closer every day. Then an enemy no rifle could stop reached America's military installations. The influenza pandemic of 1918 spread through communities, ships, camps, and training stations with terrifying speed. Across the United States, healthy young people became seriously ill within days. The armed forces were especially vulnerable because thousands of recruits lived, trained, ate, and slept in crowded conditions. In the Navy alone, more than 140,000 personnel became sick during the epidemic and thousands died. Parris Island imposed a strict quarantine. According to Leo, those restrictions prevented a larger number of deaths around him, but they also delayed his departure for approximately 6 weeks. Every additional day created a new possibility that he would miss the war or that the pandemic would reach his barracks before he could leave. The contradiction was difficult to ignore. Leo had enlisted expecting to face German artillery and machine guns, yet the first force capable of stopping his journey was invisible. While military instructors prepared him for combat, news from Michigan carried the names of people he knew who had died from the disease. The front was thousands of miles away, but death had already reached home. As the quarantine continued, Leo wrote to his mother. He tried to reassure her that he would return safely. His confidence may have comforted her, but his words also revealed that the possibility of death had become real to him. He had begun to think differently about fate, service, and the uncertainty of life. By the end of his training, he no longer considered himself a recruit. In his mind, he had earned the right to call himself a Marine. But the Atlantic still stood between him and France. After leaving Parris Island, Leo and other Marines traveled north by rail. They reached New York, crossed from Jersey City to Brooklyn, and boarded the USS Henderson at South Brooklyn. The Henderson was a military transport designed to carry Marines, troops, equipment, and horses. During the war, she repeatedly crossed the Atlantic as part of the enormous American effort to move men and material into Europe. The ship departed on October the 28th, 1918. As New York disappeared behind them, Leo saw the Statue of Liberty illuminated in the harbor. It was his final image of the United States and the beginning of his first ocean voyage. The accommodations below deck were crowded. Bunks were stacked in 3 tiers. Narrow passageways separated the sleeping areas, and hundreds of men shared a confined steel environment. The motion of the ship quickly overwhelmed Leo. During his first day at sea, he became so sick that he missed several meals. Yet discomfort did not overcome his curiosity. Once he adjusted, he explored as much of the ship as regulations allowed, studying everything from the lower compartments to the wireless equipment. Beyond the ship waited a threat the passengers could not see. Germany's campaign of unrestricted submarine warfare had helped bring the United States into the conflict. By late 1918, the convoy system, destroyer escorts, patrols, intelligence, and anti-submarine weapons had reduced the danger, but it had not disappeared completely. A battleship preceded the Henderson out of the harbor. More vessels joined the formation, and smaller warships searched the surrounding water. Leo watched destroyers race toward suspicious pieces of floating wreckage and circle them as though they had discovered an enemy. Nothing emerged. No torpedo wake appeared. No explosion broke the convoy's formation. But the absence of an attack did not mean the danger had been imaginary. It meant the escorts were doing their job. Like many servicemen, Leo understood the larger war through newspaper reports, barracks conversations, and whatever he could observe around him. He believed Henry Ford's small patrol vessels had solved the submarine problem. The reality was more complicated. Ford's Eagle boats played only a limited role, while convoys and destroyer escorts made the greater contribution. From the deck of a crowded transport, however, the distinction probably mattered little. The warships around the Henderson were evidence enough that someone stood between Leo and an unseen enemy. For nearly 2 weeks, the ship continued east. Every sunrise brought the Marines closer to the war they had trained to enter. They could not know that political and military events were moving faster than their transport. Germany was collapsing. Its armies were retreating, its allies were leaving the war, sailors had mutinied, and revolution was spreading through the country. Negotiations for an armistice were already underway, but aboard the Henderson, Leo remained a Marine bound for France. On November 9th, the ship entered Brest. The Marines waited before disembarking on the following morning. Leo had finally reached Europe. He could see military camps, ships, docks, and evidence of the enormous organization built to sustain the American expeditionary forces. He had crossed an ocean expecting that another train would carry him toward the front. Then came November 11th. At 11 o'clock in the morning, the armistice took effect. After more than 4 years of industrialized warfare, the artillery along the Western Front stopped. Cities erupted in celebration. Bells rang, crowds filled streets, and soldiers struggled to understand the sudden silence. Leo had reached France just in time to be too late. His emotions were divided. He and the other recent arrivals were relieved to have escaped the trenches. What they saw in France quickly convinced many of them that they were fortunate, but they also felt disappointed. They had trained, endured quarantine, left their families, and crossed the Atlantic to prove themselves. Now the opportunity was gone. The Marines who had fought at Belleau Wood and elsewhere possessed a combat identity the new arrivals could never share. The end of the fighting, however, did not mean the military's work was finished. Millions of Allied soldiers remained in Europe. German prisoners had to be guarded and processed. Ports, warehouses, railroads, and supply depots contained enormous quantities of military property. The wounded required care, occupation forces had to be organized, and eventually the American forces would need to be transported home. Leo was sent inland for guard duty. His journey introduced him to the French railway system, which he judged through the critical eyes of a railroad worker. American Marines rode in boxcars commonly marked to carry either 8 horses or 40 men. They spent long hours packed together as slow trains moved through a damaged and overburdened transportation network. Then Leo encountered an irony he could not ignore. The victorious Americans had traveled in boxcars, while German prisoners returning home were placed in passenger coaches. Because Leo's mother was German and he had studied the language in high school, he could speak with some of the prisoners. They offered their own explanations for the war, blaming political leaders and separating their opinions of the Kaiser from those of the Crown Prince. These conversations were not a scientific survey of German opinion. They were brief encounters between young men who, only days earlier, had officially been enemies. For Leo, the prisoners were also a reminder of what he had missed. He had wanted a chance to face German soldiers in battle. Instead, he met them after the fighting, when they were tired, defeated, and desperate to return home. As November ended, the Marines attempted to create moments of normality. For Thanksgiving, the men contributed their own money to improve the official meal. They purchased pigs, cider, vegetables, candy, cigarettes, and cigars. The feast was not the turkey dinner Leo remembered from Michigan, but it gave the company something familiar to share. The celebration also intensified his homesickness. It was his first Thanksgiving away from his family. The war had ended, yet no one could tell him exactly when he would return. The danger of combat had receded, but distance, military orders, and the immense machinery of demobilization still controlled his life. Christmas brought another encounter Leo would remember for decades. On Christmas Eve, he and several companions visited a modest French home. A middle-aged woman lived there with her elderly father, her daughter, and a 5-year-old Belgian girl who had lost her parents. The woman's husband was still serving with the French army. The Marines paid for a meal of potatoes, goat cheese, bread, wine, and coffee. It was simple food in a country exhausted by war. Communication was possible because one of the Americans spoke French. The family asked questions about the United States, while the Marines attempted to understand lives shaped by 4 years of occupation, shortages, separation, and loss. Leo had crossed the Atlantic expecting his defining moment to be a battle against the German army. Instead, one of his most enduring memories came from sharing Christmas Eve with French civilians and an orphaned Belgian child. The company again combined its money for Christmas dinner. They planned turkey, dressing, potatoes, soup, pie, and cigars. The meal offered comfort, but Leo noticed that the government provided only 2 meals that day, including the dinner the men had helped purchase themselves. His letters retained the humor and mild complaints common to service life. He could be proud of the Marine Corps while still finding reasons to question its arrangements. American news continued to reach the men in France. They debated politics, possible presidential candidates, General John Pershing, and the credit given to Marines for the fighting at Château-Thierry and Belleau Wood. Leo's opinions were those of a young Marine shaped by Corps pride and barracks conversations. They also revealed how quickly the memory of the war was becoming contested. Before all the troops had even returned home, Americans were already arguing over who deserved recognition. Leo's unit later moved through the region around Celles-sur-Cher. The ancient buildings, old roads, churches, castles, and local legends fascinated him. Stories connected the area to Roman armies, Joan of Arc, Napoleon, and imprisoned kings. Some of those accounts were folklore rather than verifiable history, but to a young man from Michigan, they created the impression that every field and stone belonged to an age far older than the United States. In January 1919, Leo was transferred to Saint-Nazaire, one of the principal ports used by American forces in France. There he performed guard duty around docks and warehouses. Chocolate, tobacco, and other supplies had been disappearing, and Marines were assigned to protect the property and control movement through the port. It was not the mission Leo had imagined when he enlisted. There were no trenches, artillery barrages, or charges against enemy positions. Yet the assignment was part of an enormous military operation. Ending an industrial war required more than signing an armistice. Ships had to be loaded, warehouses inventoried, prisoners supervised, and mountains of supplies protected while American personnel waited for transportation home. Leo guarded the machinery of demobilization. As the weeks passed, he began to appreciate the value of what he had experienced. France had changed him even without battle. He had crossed a continent and an ocean, lived among men from across the United States, endured quarantine, watched a military convoy operate, spoken with German prisoners, encountered European civilians, and seen the consequences of a war fought far from American soil. He also feared that the distance protecting the United States would allow its people to forget. Most Americans had never seen the ruined communities, military hospitals, prisoners, refugees, or families separated by the conflict. They could read casualty figures, but figures could not fully communicate what the war had done. Leo had arrived too late to witness the battles, yet he had seen enough of their aftermath to understand how easily sacrifice becomes an abstraction. His surviving letters ended on Valentine's Day in 1919, with Leo still in Saint-Nazaire. He expected to remain overseas for months and hoped to be home by the 4th of July. The military timetable proved slower. The 5th Marine Brigade continued performing guard, transportation, police, and logistical duties as the American presence in France gradually contracted. Leo eventually returned to the United States and was discharged at Hampton Roads, Virginia, on August 11, 1919, more than a year after he had left Schoolcraft. After briefly playing semi-professional baseball, he returned to the profession that had shaped his view of the world. He joined the railroad full-time. According to his family, another world war eventually brought him back into the work of national defense. During World War II, with the United States concerned about German sabotage, Leo helped guard the rail system he knew so well. The railroad man who had become a Marine once again watched over the lines connecting American cities, factories, ports, and military bases. Leo Thompson never fought the battle he had imagined. He earned no legend at Belleau Wood and returned without the experience of combat he once believed he wanted. But his story represents thousands of service members whose contribution existed beyond famous battlefields. They trained, crossed oceans, guarded prisoners, protected supplies, maintained ports, and waited while a nation attempted to bring its forces home. He reached France 2 days before the First World War ended. What appeared to be the end of his military purpose became the beginning of a different journey, one that taught him that service is not defined only by the moment weapons are fired. Sometimes it is found in the long voyage, the unseen duty, the lonely holiday, and the responsibility that remains after the guns fall silent. Thank you for staying with Leo's story until the end. Subscribe to DWWA Deepwater War Archives, and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next great stories of great wars and the extraordinary men who lived through them.